We've got this topic of lament for the month. And last week was quite emotional, just thinking about 286 and coming to the end of our era of being in 286 and all the great things that happened there. I think Clive pointed out afterwards there were lots of other things that happened in 286 that we're glad aren't going to be happening anymore, but we'll move those aside, you know, the sort of drafty, cold winter nights when we're all freezing to death. But there were some great moments in the building that we celebrate. But it's a weird time in history because everyone on the planet is suffering some form of loss, grief, or separation, isn't it? Normally you'd have a few families in a community that would have a loss or a separation, but we're in a time in history where everybody, 7 billion people on the planet, have lost something. And so I just wanted to pick up some of the teaching resources I use around Oasis and share those, which was shared with our staff a couple of months ago, and they found helpful. And I've added a few new bits of material in as well today, just to think about. But I think when we think about this topic, you can't just deal with it as a theoretical thing, can you? As soon as you start talking about loss, immediately we know what that means for us, our own personal losses we might have had during this last year or earlier in life. And so just for a minute, just to stop and think about what those losses, separations, things that you've enjoyed doing that you couldn't do. Just have a think about what some of those things have been over this last few months. You can pop them in the chat as well if you like. If I can see the chat. Okay. Well, my mum's on the call, but my mum hasn't been to see us. Yeah, so spot on what I was going to say, Kathy. We haven't actually been indoors together for months and months. So loss of peace and joy, says Kevin. And certainly for those in the NHS, there hasn't been any sort of respite at all, has there, throughout the year, meeting family. And then if you've got family overseas as well, it's just not knowing when you're going to see those family either, is it, as well at the minute? Some of our staff are in that position at City Life, not able to worship together in person yet. And it's normally Big Church Day Out, which is a big thing for Susanna, so she's missing that this weekend. And lots of personal contact, hugs. Some people were enjoying not having the hugs, Denzel, but you're different. So it's just worth bearing in mind that all of us have experienced some loss, you know, not being able to see grandparents, grandchildren, you know, it was a big thing, wasn't it, a few weeks ago, when you could start seeing family that are outside your support bubble again after so long. So I think as we start thinking about grief in our community, it's using that old analogy that is often talked about, where if you're on an aeroplane and it's crashing, it's never happened to me, but the oxygen mask dropped down. They always tell you in the safety briefing, don't they, that you have to make sure, even if you're looking after young children or whatever, that you have to put your own oxygen mask on first before trying to help other people. And I think for us, as we start thinking about grief in our community and some of the anger and the tension that causes, we'll come on to, it's knowing what that's done for us ourselves, the own personal impact of grief on us individually and how it might have affected us. And so we're going to spend a bit of time exploring that, but not just theoretically, just thinking about it for ourselves as well. So applying this concept to ourselves and really allowing ourselves to care for ourselves. Because I think in this time you can think, oh, I've had this happen, I haven't been able to see my mum, or I haven't been able to see my grand, but it's not as bad as so-and-so who've had this happen, or as bad as this person. And we almost discount the actual loss that we've had because we're not as bad as everyone else, whereas it's still a real loss, isn't it? It's just, we're in a weird time where everyone's experienced a lot of loss. So I don't know if you've seen this chart before. It's by McKinsey.com, who do a lot of psychotherapy work. And this is the sort of train of thought that they've got, that grief leads to disillusionment, that leads to uncertainty and leads to exhaustion. And I don't know if you think that was true for you. You could again just say in the chat whether you think that's true. I think we've certainly had meetings this week where we started talking about restarting things and doing new things. And some people just said, I'm just tired out. I just don't know if I got energy for anything. And even doing small social things can actually seem quite exhausting, can't they? Because we've just been out of the habit of doing that sort of stuff. And then what they've said is, this McKinsey, is grit and determination aren't enough. Heroic response is not an authentic, ongoing response. Something else is required. So I think when we first entered lockdown last year, there was a lot of adrenaline fueled grit and determination to get through things. But what they're saying now is, these psychotherapists, is that we don't need heroism now. We need people to understand that a lot of people on the planet are just exhausted, tired, and haven't got much to give. And so what they're saying is needed at this time from leaders is empathy and compassion towards others and ourselves. I don't know if you agree with that. And empathy, there's some, I've done a little word cloud there. I've picked one up, a word cloud around that. But it's really about hearing other people, not trying to fix their situations, which probably last year there was a lot more fixing of people's need of food, need of connection, and so on. But whereas now what's needed is people that can really listen and connect and not try and solve their issues, which we're always trying to talk about within city life anyway. So I've got a short video now. I don't know if any Brené Brown fans here. Now the video, I know the videos don't always work brilliantly on Zoom, so I'll share the link as well for you to watch later if it doesn't play well. But Brené Brown, I'm a big fan of, but she's done a little video about empathy, a little cartoon one. So I'll show you this, see what you think to this, but it is very insightful.
So what is empathy, and why is it very different than sympathy? Empathy fuels connection. Sympathy drives disconnection. Empathy, it's very interesting. Teresa Wiseman is a nursing scholar who studied professions, very diverse professions where empathy is relevant, and came up with 4 qualities of empathy. Perspective taking, the ability to take the perspective of another person or recognize their perspective as their truth. Staying out of judgment, not easy when you enjoy it as much as most of us do. Recognizing emotion in other people and then communicating that. Empathy is feeling with people. And to me, I always think of empathy as this kind of sacred space when someone's kind of in a deep hole and they shout out from the bottom and they say, I'm stuck, it's dark, I'm overwhelmed. And then we look and we say, hey, you climb down. I know what it's like down here, and you're not alone. Sympathy is, ooh, it's bad, no, you want a sandwich? Empathy is a choice, and it's a vulnerable choice, because in order to connect with you, I have to connect with something in myself that knows that feeling. Rarely, if ever, does an empathic response begin with at least. Yeah. And we do it all the time. Because you know what? Someone just shared something with us that's incredibly painful, and we're trying to silver lining it. I don't think that's a verb, but I'm using it as one. We're trying to put the silver lining around it. So, I had a miscarriage. Oh, at least you know you can get pregnant. I think my marriage is falling apart. At least you have a marriage. John's getting kicked out of school. At least Sarah is an A student. But one of the things we do sometimes in the face of very difficult conversations is we try to make things better. If I share something with you that's very difficult, I'd rather you say, I don't even know what to say right now, I'm just so glad you told me. Because the truth is, rarely can a response make something better. What makes something better is connection.
Yeah, I don't know what you made of that little video. It's food for thought, isn't it? And I find myself saying, at least quite often, people try and bring some positivity and optimism to a situation. I don't know what reaction you have when you see this photo. It's probably the iconic photo of the year, isn't it? But again, just in chat, what response do you have to this photo? What word would you use to describe it? Reduced and small, devastating, alone. Loneliness. Thanks, Fix. Sadness for her. Yeah, I want to give her a hug. My world will be different from now on, and feel really sad for her. It was it's quite a moment, wasn't it? Because I think, you know, others in her position might have tried to break the rules, but she's just held a real sense of dignity and respect there, hasn't she? And to do the right thing and to be alone in her grief. And it was very moving to see, was it, as the front page of the paper the next day. And I had people in the academy that said, you know, I was invited around someone's house and I thought, how could I go around someone's house to have a meal inside if the Queen would sit there on her own at the funeral and respect the rules and do that? How could I behave any differently than her? So it was real leadership, wasn't it, from her? But I think it summed up a lot of people's experience of grief, like, and particularly bereavement, is just felt very alone in their sadness. The people that we've had on the bereavement journey course, we ran a 6-week course online for Southampton, and had people that had never really met each other before just join online. It was still pretty grim when we started, as in the weather was cold and you weren't allowed to see anybody inside, and most people had had a significant loss, you know, of partners or mums or sons, and but they were able to come together. But there was a sense really of them all being a bit like this image, alone in their grief in their own house without family and friends to comfort them very much. So it was nice through the weeks, because we came to the end of that on Thursday, just to see them meet a few more family and friends over the last 2 weeks as they've come out of lockdown. But I think, you know, it's worth us remembering that for a lot of people, they've just been very alone in their sadness, separation, and they've not had that comfort and warmth from family and friends at this time. And maybe that's true for us as well. There was a couple of, this is one slide that I use a lot with schools, particularly when there's been a sudden death. And there's another clever little video that shows the way the brain works. I know you'll know this, but when we're in shock, the blood drains away from our face, does certainly from mine, and we go white or a paler shade. And all the blood from our surface skin goes to the main functions. It goes to our heart, lungs, and the primal part of the brain. So the brain's got that primal part of it there. There's Kevin will help me with the name, but I forget. But the reptilian brain survival part here is the thing that functions everything that we need to survive. And then the cortex goes over the top. And when we're in shock, it's like the lid flips open, and this is all that's functioning, just this part here, as survival aspects of our brain. And so we find that when we're in shock and when there's been a loss, so we get this brain fog, it's called, and we can't think properly and we can't process well. And so that's why I try and help schools with some of the work that I do, so that when they've had a sudden loss in a school, you're helping them to understand why these fake stories come out and people make bad decisions and they present all sorts of funny stories. It's literally because this part of their brain just isn't functioning properly, and they're just in survival mode. And maybe for some of us that have been in some of the more traumatic episodes or bereavement scenarios, we found ourselves in that situation where we're really just surviving. We find ourselves, you know, the heart beating faster, and we're in a bit of shock and survival mode. Yeah, Susanna bought me a great book, which is this one. It's a firefighter training one called The Heat of the Moment. And it's a lady who actually trains other firefighters, like the Gold Commanders, who go into the severe situations when there's a huge fire or a terrorist situation, they train the fire brigade how to react when their brain has stopped working. So you'll have someone who's quite experienced suddenly faced with a scene of desolation and destruction, and they'll have this happen to them, and they're suddenly not thinking clearly and they're not making the right decisions. And she teaches them, coaches them how to gather themselves, breathe properly, take stock, and then work through a systematic way of responding to any crisis that they find. And so it's a fascinating book, but she goes through exactly that, how our brains stop working when we're in shock. And then the secondary part of that is really this secondary stress that happens, that even if we, so it's a bit mesmerizing, isn't it, looking at that? Even if we are the one who's personally had the loss, if we talk to people who have had loss and who are grieving and who are stressed, that has a knock-on effect to us. It's a bit like, when we used to do the street pass, when I used to do street passes, someone would occasionally vomit on you. Sorry, it's not very pleasant. But you don't get physical vomit with this, but it's almost like someone has emotionally vomited over you, and you're suddenly left with that mess that the person's spilt out onto you. And so you're not personally stressed, but that secondary stress comes to you, and you're left with, what do you do with that? And sometimes you think, well, it's not my loss or it's not my grief, so it doesn't really stress me. But the reality is, it does. There's another great book, I don't think I've got it up here, called The Body Keeps the Score by de Kolk. And he goes through the impact of secondary stress and primary stress on our bodies. But let me ask you one more question. What strikes you about this particular photo that we've got here? Anything? Anything in the chat on this particular photo? Yeah, upset and distraught, trying to stop his tears. You often get that thing that men shouldn't cry, don't you, as well? And it does get a bit stiff upper lip. But one of the interesting things will come, and so the body does keep the score. But one of the interesting things we've been looking at, Fox is just coming in, is how tears are all different. Did you know this before? Nod or shake your head if you knew this already. Gary's shaking his head. And Bev's she's written something about tears that we're going to listen to at the end. But actually, every type of tear is different. So if you were crying because you'd had because you were chopping onions, and then you put those tears under the microscope, that's what it would look like, bottom left. Laughing tears would look like bottom right. Tears of change, top right. And then these tears of grief, you can see they look completely different. So you have that crying, but then you have that emotional crying. When you've cried like that, you feel better for having a good cry, is often what it's described as. And but when you check the chemicals within these tears of grief, they contain cortisone and they contain other stress hormones that would be in there. So when we cry like that, when we emotionally cry, have that good cry, stress is literally leaving our body. It's coming out through the tear ducts. It's a great design feature, isn't it, of our body, that we can get this stress, that if it stayed in our body, it would have a count on us. It would do damage to us. So stress inside our bodies causes all those pains, the migraines and the unexplained stomach pains and the headaches, all those things we get because of stress and grief. And here we have this release of stress through our tears. So I thought you'd find that fascinating. You can Google it, Topography of Tears by Rosalind Fisher there. And then Bev found this verse, so I can't take credit for this, but in Psalm 38, verse 9, in the Passion Translation, it uses this phrase, "My tears are liquid words and you can read them all." And I thought, linked with the photos here, and they're all different. Actually, it's true, isn't it, that if you looked at these and you knew about tears and the topography of tears, you could tell from someone's tears what they were thinking at the time or feeling. It's quite amazing, isn't it? And here, tucked away in the Psalms, is this sense that God can look at our tears and read them, read what's there, read what's been in our hearts that has been discharged through our ears. It's quite fascinating, isn't it? So this is de Kolk again. So he says trauma leads to stress, stress leads to physiological impact, and physiological impact leads to harm. And so one way or another, that trauma that we've experienced, that pain we've experienced, will have a result of harm unless we find healthy ways for that grief and stress to leave our bodies. So we do things like go on holiday, go to green nature parks, we breathe and we eat well, sleep well, all those things to get rid of that stress. But if we don't, if we just try and suppress it and tuck it down, it will cause harm in our bodies, all sorts of weird and strange ways people can do that. Sometimes people can not grieve for 5 or 6 months and then suddenly all their hair falls out or they get hives all over their body, all sorts of things. And they go to the doctor and the doctor says, are you under any stress at all? And it's because of this. Here's another quote by Parker Palmer. Violence is what happens when we don't know what to do with our suffering. Violence is what happens when we don't know what to do with our suffering. And we see that, don't we? That as there's been suffering around the world, there's also been a rise of violence and anger and fights within communities and different things that have risen up around the planet that have caused violence to happen. And that can happen to other people, but it can also be violence to our own selves with the rise of self-harm and suicide that we're seeing at the moment. And this is de Kolk, another quote from his book, The Body Keeps the Score, which is like a master's book that they use for psychology. When no one wants to hear about a person's trauma, it finds a way to manifest in their body. When no one wants to hear a person's trauma, it finds a way to manifest in the body. And so going back to the Brené Brown, you can see how it's important to hear another person, to have that empathy and connection with them. So everyone responds differently. We go back to the chat now. When you're in a stressful situation, what do? Fight, flight, or denial? What's your response? Freeze, says Bev. Denial, Kathy. Hide, says Jean. Yeah, I think when we're in stressful situations, sometimes you just want to curl up in a bed, don't you, and disappear. Carry on, says Matt, and shut down, Kevin. Yeah. So it's funny, isn't it? Like sometimes people that are really bubbly and fighty and so on in life, when it comes to stressful situation, they can go all quiet. And sometimes people who are quiet, they can suddenly become the fighters. Susanna and Elizabeth put run away. So I have to leave the chat for a second so I can see my slides. So everyone is different. The other question I had in here is if we picture grief as a terrain, grief has a terrain. So some days you're going to be feeling good, like you're on top of a mountain or by the lake there. Other days you're going to feel like you're in the middle of a dark forest and you can't see your way out, or you're climbing up the mountain and it's really hard work and you can't wait to get to the end of it. And if you look at the clouds in that picture as well, you've got blue sky on the right hand side, and then on the other side you've got these slightly darker clouds that are there, and it sort of sums up grief really, I think, this picture, that we can move in between there. So I don't know if you could picture yourself anywhere in this picture. If you were to be anywhere, where would you be within it? Where would you see yourself placed right now? Any ideas on that one, where you place yourself? Coming out of the forest, thanks, Kathy. Oh, sorry, I think just slow down. With Clive fishing down the river. In the shadow of the mountain, trying to get to the sunlight. Yeah, that would be a nice place to be. Vicky on the beach, very wise. In the rapids or stuck in the mud. In the wood, can't see too far. Yeah, that's the thing though, like the forest is nice, isn't it? And you get some shade in there, but you can't see your way out at all. So it's a scary place to be. Climbing the mountain very slowly. Thanks, Joan. Because the mountain seems like a good idea until we start climbing, doesn't it? Top of the mountain is nice, but it's also cool up there, and you've still got the descent to sort of face, haven't you, afterwards? Between the forest and the high place. That looks like a nice place to be fair, that place. And looking for a way out of the forest. Yeah, this forest here, you could lose yourself in there for weeks, can you? Thanks, David. So I like this picture a lot. I think it helps me to think through where I'm at, and also chatting to kids sometimes just to try and see where they're at with things. But there's a few Psalm 23 things in here as well, isn't there? The dark valleys and the still waters that we can look at, and the green pastures are just about there if you look carefully. And then these are the 5 stages of grief, which is Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. And she always regretted, she said at the end of her life, like presenting it as stages of grief, because she knew it was not a sort of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, but it was a cyclic thing, and you might feel all of those things in one day. There was no sort of moving from one to the other in a linear way. So she slightly regretted that. But I think looking at these, denial is big, isn't it? When we get shocking news, we'd straight away say, I don't believe it, or it can't be true, and are you sure? And I've certainly done that before in my time. Anger is, and Bev taught me this, I'm sure, but anger is a guardian, isn't it? It guards our heart, it protects us from the pain underneath. But anger also gives us time just to process hard news and to direct anger at something that's gone wrong, that shouldn't have happened and isn't right. And we might feel that about situations that we've had. Depression, Elizabeth Kubler, she wasn't talking about a clinical depression, but just a lowness of mood, which I don't know, I think we see a lot of now, don't we? I'm not seeing a lot of people very bubbly at the minute. Sort of as we're coming out of lockdown, there's some glimmers of light, but generally people still got quite a low mood. I don't know what you think. And bargaining is quite big in the Christian world, I think, because we tend to sort of do our deals with God. You know, if this happens, then God, I'll do this for you. And but also it's those questions of, if only I'd done this, or if only I'd done that, and I shouldn't have done this. It's that sort of sense of guilt, and I could have done more, and then this wouldn't have happened. Whereas the reality of most loss and grief is that isn't the case. The losses would have happened regardless of whatever we're offering to put up in place. And the last one there is acceptance, not about accepting the terrible thing that's happened, but coming to an acceptance of a new reality, which I guess with the pandemic, we are thinking about as well. You know, what is it going to look like post lockdown? Because COVID hasn't gone away, has it? There's still strains and things that are happening. We can't just quickly travel to our friends in New Zealand or somewhere because there's still restrictions. And so working out what that new reality is, something we're doing as church as well. You know, what have we got energy to do? What are we able to do? How do we want to gather and things like that? It's accepting a new reality. So it's an opportunity for us to do something new and different. But it's like when you have a loss in a family, you know, maybe someone always took out the bins and now someone else has got to do it. And it's going to be hard the first time you're the one taking out the bins for the first time. It's only a silly example, that one, but it's all these things. We're suddenly in new routines, aren't we? Where we, if you go for a coffee, you've got to do your track and trace, and you've got to order at the table. So all these new ways of doing things, we've got to get used to. If we're going to travel, we've got to do this, this, and this. And so, so it's a big part of what's happening, you know, and it's exhausting for people. I think going back to that exhaustion thing, because nothing is straightforward and we have to learn new routines all the time. It is exhausting. So I'll skip that. Well, I'll just mention it as a homework thing, and then I'll hand on to Bev. But with those 5 things, you know, the mind map where you just draw lines out from them and think, well, what does anger look like? And you could do this for anything. You could do that for your own situation, your family. You could do it for your workplace. You know, where are you seeing anger outbursts in your workplace or in your school, with words or actions or with people's thoughts? And then if people have been stewing on this anger for the last year and they haven't really had a chance to properly say anything about it because they've been in lockdown and they thought, I can't really say on Zoom, but I really am getting cheesed off of this. And it grows and grows and grows for a year. And it's quite a dangerous thing, isn't it? When we start coming back together, because there's this pent up anger that's maybe been stored away for a little while, or this pent up depression, or this pent up sense of guilt about something. And so that's where, again, the empathy is really important, to actually try and work out where people are and how far they've, you know, what this journey, this grief journey of the pandemic has meant for them. So I'll send you as a piece of homework. You know, if you think about your scenario, how is anger outplaying in your workplace, family? What does acceptance look like in your workplace, family? And what about for us as church? You know, where do we see denial, anger, depression, bargaining, acceptance in city life? You know, as we have lost the building, there's been some new routines that we picked up, but what do we really feel has happened to us as a church around these 5 areas as well? So if you like mind maps, that's your little homework, and I'll stop sharing. Did I miss anything in the chat? Just got one little thing there. Where are you? Yes, thanks, Bev. So I will spotlight Bev. And we're going to go back to the tears and just think about how God reads these liquid words in the psalm.
Okay. So yes, I've just written a few words called The Wonder of Tears, which I actually wrote quite a while ago. And because I looked at the whole subject of tears being a big crier. And that's when I found the topography stuff of tears as well. So that's part of this little ditty as well. So hopefully it will just speak to you somewhere. The wonder of tears, flowing down my cheeks again, leaving all too familiar tracks, streams of emotion that can't be voiced another way, rising uninvited from some hidden place inside, they pool and spill over, all composure left aside. Vulnerability on display, there's nowhere to hide, my innermost feelings laid out for all to see, and this always seems to happen, especially to me. The one who loves me says they are his gift, not always easy to carry, but a blessing all the same. And inside each tear is a comforting, healing balm, cleansing our heart wounds and soothing our pain, keeping us from bitterness through bottling things inside and drawing us close to him who longs to dry our eyes. The one who loves us is a heart reader, an interpreter of our tears, salty expressions of our deepest heart needs, every teardrop collected and crystallized to form an intricate pattern, a unique formation of our particular joy or sorrow, hope or fear. Tears of elation like a bare branched tree in winter, clear and hopeful for spring. Tears of grief like a vast desert space peppered with clusters of dwellings, the promise of life to come. Tears of change like bubbles of foam frothing with possibility or densely sown seeds potent with fruit. Tears of release like a newly formed island cast off from the mainland into a spacious sea. Tears of remembrance like long storehouses filled with boxes of treasures and memories of old, cherished, preserved, and never to be forgotten. The collector of tears interprets them all as liquid prayers to him and takes them into his soul. Not one falls to the ground or is lost. Not one goes unheard or unremembered. The one who loves me has collected my every tear, all those I've wept over many a year. He says he has used them, transformed them if you like, to establish a garden, the garden of my heart. My tears have not been wasted, and their beauty now I see as I look at all that's blooming and see heaven's artistry. The fragrance of the flowers with sweet and heady notes, the vibrancy of their colours, the perfection of their form, all speak a hopeful message of redemption to be found when we place our sorrows into the gardener's hands. As we walk together through swathes of forget-me-nots, I'm reminded of his faithfulness to work all things for my good. And I find myself so grateful that he loves me and he cares. And I'm thankful for his gifts and the wonder of tears. Psalm 38:9. Lord, you know all my desires and deepest longings. My tears are liquid words, and you can read them all.
Great, thanks, Bev. Amazing, eh? I think it's a revelation. Whenever we do this grief and loss course and we talk about tears having stress hormones in them, the kids are just amazed because quite often they get told not to cry. And so this idea that actually they could be helpful to us and take the stress out of the body and stop us from causing harm to us. But I think that extra Psalm 38 verse 9, which just says that God actually reads them, it's amazing, isn't it? Like, it's really reassuring for us to know that God is that close to us. So the last thing I was going to say is just, I think it's very important how we speak with people at this time. Like, if we're prickly and grumpy, it's hard for people that have really suffered. It's trying to bear in mind that everyone around us literally has suffered in some way in this last year. And so for us to be gentle and patient, those fruits of the Holy Spirit, is really important, isn't it? To be considerate and to, not everyone has had the same experience of us, and people have had losses that they've not told anyone about. And so it's important how we speak, and then our ability to be able to listen is really key now, isn't it? To really be able to ask people how they've been, what they've been doing, and then just really listening without doing the silver lining. At least we're back to normal now, and all the silver lining stuff that just squashes that empathy. So hope that's encouraging for you. Do we want to do anything else now, like breakout rooms or anything? I don't know what normally happens, but I shall stop recording anyway.